Hello and welcome to this special episode of Epochs, where I shall be talking all about the history of Russia and Ukraine. And I am joined by the brilliant Apostolic Majesty. How are you, sir?
I'm good. I mean, we had a bit of an incident in terms of being able to arrange this, but no, I'm glad we're finally here, and always glad to be on the show and to talk about this topic. So, thank you once again for having me on.
No, it's absolutely our pleasure. So a few weeks ago, Tucker Carlson interviewed Vladimir Putin. And Vladimir Putin used that example. They're talking all about Ukraine, of course. And Putin used that example, that opportunity, to sort of go back to the 9th century to talk about relations between Ukraine and Russia, or even using those words are problematic. Now, there was some backlash in the mainstream media, on the BBC and Twitter, and people like Tom Holland and whatever, claiming Putin was just factually wrong about all sorts of things. And you did what I thought was a superb stream, and you did say a few times it was off the cuff. It didn't seem like it was off the cuff. It was a great example of somebody that's got a fantastic amount of knowledge. You've got far more than I have, so I'm hoping to pick your brain in this. But Putin decided to go back to the 9th century, to go back to Rurik in the 860s, to sort of start his story, start his narrative there. I think one of the things overall you were saying is that Putin might have been wrong here or there, especially in the more modern era, in sort of the 20th century era, but what he wasn't necessarily all that factually inaccurate, but what he was doing was conflating things, and there was some sort of few lies by omission here and there. So I thought we could just dig into it, if that's all right with you. So one of the first things I wanted to say or ask, and it's a giant question which probably hasn't really got a straightforward answer, but sort of where does Russia as a state begin? I'm sure there's all sorts of arguments. Different people would argue different things. Where does Ukraine begin? I mean, so for example, let's just start here. Would you start the story of Russia, whatever that means, with Rurik, the Scandinavian, the Varangian? What would he be in modern sense, a Swede or something? What do you think about Putin starting his story with Rurik in the 9th century?
Well, something you could perhaps criticize Putin about here is what exactly does it mean to be a state, and what do we mean by starting Russia? I mean, are we starting Russia as a culture? Are we starting Russia as a civilization? I mean, it may not seem very significant to, I don't know, a lay person listening to this sort of information, used to these terms being used interchangeably, but they are important because I would say they demark different points in history. You're right in the sense that he was a Swede. I mean, it's probably more appropriate in the 9th century to say that Rurik was a Viking. Okay. But in terms of, I don't know, the gathering of something that could be considered a quote unquote Rus civilization, that being some sort of Viking East Slavic amalgamation, I think you can look at that as an origin point. What Putin specifically was trying to do in terms of drawing this back to modern Russian history and the history of Ukraine is by saying that this history began with the foundation of two cities, Novgorod in the north and Kiev in the south. And that, of course, is a testament to the fact that the Russians began their civilization as great seafarers, and then, of course, greater river navigators. They were able to dominate the rivers of the Volga, the Dnieper, and using that, they were actually able to destroy the Khazars and other sort of nomadic conquerors found in that region. But that essentially is why Putin brought up the history going back to that point, is that he believes that the origin of the actual Ukrainian heartland, one could say, around the city of Kiev, is in itself a foundational city for the creation of a Rus civilization, which he believes to be a Russian civilization. It may be confusing etymologically to use these terms, because when Putin says Russia, he means Rus, whereas virtually all historiographers in the West will use Rus and Russia as separate entities. And the reason I would always put an asterisk behind using either Russia or Rus, it's to demarcate the difference between the point you brought up at the beginning, between a culture and a state. With Russia, we have the beginning, I would say, of a state, which is what most Western historians are used to referring to as. With Rus, we have the beginning of a civilization. Hopefully that answers your question.
So a Russian state certainly doesn't go back to the 9th century around Kiev. That's wrong to say that, right?
Civilization.
That's not Russia, isn't it? Right, there's no continuity between the 9th century Kievan Rus around Kiev on the Dnieper and the modern state of Russia in the 21st century. Is that right?
There is a continuity.
Okay.
It's very complicated because there's a lot of nuance in terms of referring to this, and this is why I'm trying to be as favourable and charitable to people like Timothy Snyder as possible and Tom Holland, and say that Timothy Snyder more so because he's an actual historian of Ukraine as opposed to Tom Holland, where they don't really understand the nuances, the terms, and maybe they're taking the literal interpretation of what Putin said and then roundly dismissing him as entirely wrong. My objection is that he believes the origin of the modern Rus civilization begins with Rurik, when I believe that's incredibly contentious. My specific contention is that he believed it was the beginning of a centralized Russian state, which is absolutely ludicrous. But in terms of trying to trace
that's what I meant really, as a centralized state, because that's what Putin said, wasn't it? Those were his words, at least in translation. And that is incorrect to say that, right?
Yes. I mean, just to give you an overview of how you can draw some sort of state continuity, just for the sake of clarification. At the beginning of during the middle of the 9th century through to the 10th century, we have a series of Rurikid sort of principalities, I think is a fair word to say, but they're more or less bandit communities. One of the first things the Russians did upon entering into the world stage is attempt to sack Constantinople. So they were little more than Visigoths or sort of tribal raiders of antiquity, if you sort of put them in the great scheme of nomadic conquerors, of which there were so many from the 4th century up until really, you could say, the Hungarians in the 10th century. You can sort of slot the original Rus into those sort of peoples. But the point that Putin was making in terms of, again, he contradicts himself several times. I think this could have used a script doctor or something if he was, like, I do almost believe it was off the cuff for him, which would excuse a few points. But going back to this point about a continuity of Rus statehood, it really seemed that he was implicitly saying that it begins with Vladimir the Great, who was the great ruler who Christianized the Rus and formed an alliance with the Byzantines. And it's from there you can say that the Rus eschewed the idea of essentially being great nomadic, semi-nomadic conquerors or sort of bandit principalities, and they decided to quote unquote civilize. It should be noted, however, that Vladimir the Great didn't have some sort of absolute predilection towards Christianity, as Putin claimed, due to the influence of his grandmother, Princess Olga. But he had actually tried to synthesize all of the pagan religions in Russia at the time. And then he'd actually gone out and sent emissaries to try and form an alliance with the Pope and other factions like this. And but ultimately he decided to yield to the soft power of Constantinople.
So that Vladimir the Great, Vladimir the First, or is Saint Vladimir, isn't he? So that's then that we're talking the late 10th century at that point.
Yes, the late 10th century and the early 11th century. And from Putin's perspective, we can then draw from that again, in terms of centralized state, this is why I find the term very anathema. You have you can say a hierarchy of principalities. You have Kiev, and one of the reasons why this existed is because the Rus civilization or the pre-Russian civilization was so big. It was almost impossible in terms of being able to exert a unified state across such a large, disparate and depopulated region, other than through dominating a series of river forts, essentially. And through these river forts tended to be the steading of a Rurikid prince, and the Rurikid prince was shown nominal deference to the Grand Prince, who was situated in Kiev. But again, that is, you can say, the origin of a Rus statehood, whether it's a Russian statehood, again, really comes down to your use of terminology. And I believe that Putin sees this as a continuity of Russian statehood. We look at figures such as Saint Vladimir, Vladimir the Great. We go to Yaroslav the Wise, and then we try and form a connection between some of these principalities, which have a connection to Kiev, and then draw this to the foundation of Moscow. And the problem in terms of being able to draw a link between this is the Mongol invasion. But just to ignore the Mongol invasion and try to almost create a domino effect in terms of where Moscow fits into this. Kiev remains a sort of the great sort of jewel of Rus civilization during the 11th century until it's sacked during one of these perennial disputes over succession, which dominated the Rurikid princes. They were basically in a permanent state of civil war throughout the later 11th and 12th centuries before the Mongols came. But from Moscow, we then see the supremacy of the Rus moving to a city called Vladimir, and the principality is called Vladimir Suzdal. All of these cities, Kiev and Vladimir Suzdal, are sacked, and basically their statehood is destroyed by the Mongols. And so the primacy of the Rus then moves to a city in the north, which was one of the founding cities of the Rus called Novgorod. And from Novgorod, the Prince Alexander Nevsky decides to give all of his sons principalities in the new sort of post-Mongol Rus civilization. And one of these princes is Daniel, who inherits Moscow. So that is you can say the link in terms of a continuity of Russian statehood, is that we go from Kiev to Vladimir to Novgorod to Moscow. And indeed, when Moscow was basically under the yoke of the Mongols, the other princes around Moscow would compete for a title, the Grand Prince of Vladimir, explicitly linking back to the older city, Vladimir Suzdal, which had inherited that original primacy from the Rus during the 12th century. I know this sounds very complicated, but if I'm going to delve deep into Russian medieval history, you can draw a very, very tentative link between all of these things, and of course the continuity of the Rurik dynasty. However, my main contention again is the use of the word state, and in extreme with the use of the word centralized state.
So with the Mongols, that's the pardon me, that's the Golden Horde, right? The Golden Horde Mongols.
Well, the Mongols, the Golden Horde was a ulus, or a division of the Mongols.
Sure, yeah, but that's the one that sort of went through, Moscow, right?
Well, yes. I mean, it's if I recall, did you and Carl talk about Subutai at one point, or am I?
No, we haven't yet. We've done Attila the Hun, obviously much hundreds of years earlier, and we're going to do Genghis and then the heirs of Genghis. So we haven't actually done it yet, but we've threatened to a number of times. It is on the docket, but we haven't actually done it yet.
Well, this may amuse you then, because Subutai is one of these sort of great general adventurers throughout history. I mean, I would almost say he's the Mongol equivalent of some sort of Hernan Cortez sort of figure. He leads the scouting missions ahead of the main Mongol host. So while Genghis Khan is ruining the Khwarezmian Empire, Subutai is going through the Caucasus and pillaging and raping those kingdoms along the Caucasus. But then, of course, in what you can say to be the most successful scouting mission ever, he goes further. He attacks I believe it's the chronology of these sort of tribes sort of escapes me sometimes, but I believe it was the Kuman Kipchaks he encountered. But then he went off to encounter the Rus. And the Rus, for one of their first times in history, since Yaroslav the Wise, came out with a united army to face the Mongols under Subutai. And I've equivocated this with the Russian version of Agincourt, because the Rus came out and they were massacred. Basically, the original aristocracy of the Rurikid princes were annihilated by Subutai. And those that survived were placed under essentially you can say it's basically like a dance platform, and were crushed as the Mongols were celebrating on top of them. Really quite horrifying stuff. And then the rest of the Rurikid princes, the ones who had escaped the battle and survived, most of them basically came into some form of tributary relation with the Ottomans when they came around for a second time under Ogadai Khan and Batu Khan. They razed all the great cities, having already annihilated the cream of the Russian aristocracy. And they attack and destroy the great cities, like I said, of Kiev and Vladimir. And after the Mongols finally retreat, having nearly conquered Poland and Hungary in the 1240s, then they essentially carve out one of the, I believe it's a nephew or a cousin of Genghis Khan, Batu Khan, carves out a section of his empire, which is the Golden Horde. And it's that Golden Horde which is going to adopt the incredibly complicated system of tributary sort of overlord state vis-a-vis all the Russian princes up until the late 15th century.
I was just saying, so that sort of all begins there, or is it sort of 13th century stuff? So, you can trust the Mongols to... It's terrifying, actually, isn't it? There was nothing to stop them going all the way through Central and even Western Europe. If history had played out slightly differently, you could have had Mongol hordes in France or something. Who knows? But anyway,
Frederick the Second, Frederick Stupamundi Hohenzollern, who had conquered Jerusalem in a crusade, one of his final acts as emperor was actually to gather a great imperial host of the Italians and the Germans to defend Bohemia and defend what was then essentially Austria from the Mongol host, had they not been delivered by Ogedai's premature death, and they all went back scurrying to the Kurultai. So yes, that was a possibility.
I mean, who knows if the Hohenzollern allies would have been...
Hohenstaufen.
Hohenstaufen, sorry. I was going to say, so much later, isn't it? Much later. Yeah. But anyway, who knows whether that coalition would have stopped the Mongols? Who knows? But anyway, we're getting sidetracked. One thing, actually, can we go back in time a little bit, back to Vladimir I and the so-called baptism of Russia, again in the 10th century, right? Do you put much or any real emphasis on that? Let's drop the word centralised. If where Putin was talking about a centralised state, let's drop the centralised bit, because anyone who's being reasonable wouldn't go along with that. But just the idea of a state or some sort of predecessor state in which the modern or later medieval and then modern states were formed out of. Do you put much emphasis on that baptism of Russia, or do you think that's something that there isn't really any continuity between that and now? What are your feelings about that?
Well, barring his attempt to reconcile Soviet history with the grand continuity of Russian history, I believe that's an essential component of Putin's argument here, is that he believes to be Russian is to be Orthodox. And the literal baptism of Russia came in the form of Vladimir the Great yielding to the Eastern Orthodox Church, which was then based in Constantinople. Because if you look at, you can say, Russia's religious and imperial teleology, it moves on from that. The Byzantines basically suffer, as do the Russians. But the Russians, with their Orthodox faith, use that again as a point of contention when resisting the encroachments of the Mongols in the 13th century. One of the sort of great legitimating factors of Alexander Nevsky during the 13th century is that he was able to hold on to the Russian Orthodox religion, despite technically being a vassal of the Ottomans, as do later the Muscovites, the Muscovy state, which was, as a result of that tenuous sort of continuity I tended to draw earlier. So in terms of a definition of Rus, later Russian statehood, in opposition to all of its surrounding powers, so in the West, these would be Catholics, and later in the North, Scandinavian Protestants. And in the East, these would be Buddhists, Muslims, what have you. Compared to all of these factors, Russian Orthodoxy is seen as a point of national differentiation. And going on from these points, when we come to the first Tsar of Russia, the first person to use the title Tsar, which was Ivan III, the great gatherer of lands, he believed that he was taking that legitimacy directly from Constantinople after it had been taken over by the Turks. And then when Ivan IV was crowned, Ivan the Terrible, the Metropolitan, if I believe, Mercurius, took that as an incident of basically saying that Russia has now become a grand Orthodox imperial amalgamation. and that to be Russian essentially was to be the preserver of the Orthodox faith. So the Tsar had the affections towards Christ were obvious, and indeed the Tsar essentially was Christ on earth, and he was the defender of the Orthodox faith, which was seen as the only true faith, and that link between the Tsar and the Orthodox Tsar continues right up until the deposition of the Romanovs in 1917. And indeed, you can say when they are killed, the Romanov family in 1918, or the immediate sort of Romanovs, the family of Nicholas II, they are martyred by the Russian Orthodox Church as those who died in faith. So this deliberate association between orthodoxy and the ruling sort of mantra of Russia is the thread which connects Russia from Vladimir the Great all the way up until the modern day Russia, with the exception of the explicitly atheistic anti-Orthodox state, which was the Soviet Union throughout most of the 20th century.
Right, so one thing, maybe you could help me untangle this. Hopefully this isn't a question that requires a whole lecture in and of itself. I'm sure it could do. But if the baptism of Russia under sort of Saint Vladimir I, if that's sort of around the sort of 988 or something, 990 odd, that's pre the Great Schism, right? So where does Russian Orthodoxy come in that in relation to Roman Catholicism?
Well, this I don't want to go on too far of a tangent here.
Okay,
because
no, fair enough.
I want to answer your question, but I don't want to lead it into what could be a sort of 4-hour-long conversation.
Yeah, no, please don't. Yeah,
as you're sort of stunted into silence. but anyway, my contention has always been that the Great Schism is a bit of is more a definitive point of departure as opposed to an immediate point of departure. By that I mean the church had already split long before then. I believe you can say the real point of departure was when Charlemagne was crowned in the year 800, which would be 254 years before the official Great Schism. During that time, the church based in Constantinople and the church based in Rome were basically competing to convert all the various pagan rulers that were surrounding themselves. So, for example, obviously the church in Rome achieved a great coup by crowning the Christian Franks. And then, of course, Charlemagne would go off and fight his war against the pagan Saxons. Indeed, you can even say that when William the Conqueror conquered England in 1066, this was seen as a great triumph for the papacy, and William the Conqueror was just his agent. But likewise, with the church based in Constantinople, what later essentially became differentiated as the Orthodox vis-a-vis the Catholic Church, got a big win in terms of being able to convert the Bulgarians and later on the Russians. So in terms of looking at sort of Russia sort of vis-a-vis Catholicism, and actually, in terms of trying to bring it back to Ukraine, because we haven't really mentioned Ukraine at all, but without even using that term, because I'm loath to use that term for various reasons. But that point regarding Catholicism v. Orthodoxy is actually foundational in terms of my understanding of this topic, because when the Venetians sacked Constantinople in the year 1204, and when the Mongols destroyed essentially the great Rus principalities a few decades later, all of a sudden, as you can probably imagine the great map of Europe in front of you, Orthodoxy was at its absolute nadir. The Catholic states were on the ascendant everywhere, from Poland to Scandinavia, and now even Constantinople itself was occupied by a Catholic power. And so essentially there were no great Orthodox princes left. And the church used this as an opportunity, essentially, to bring over a great Rus prince to become Catholic and to begin the process of Catholicizing Russia. And if memory serves me, this was a figure known as Daniel of Halyach, Halyach being a principality in what is now the extreme west of Ukraine, near the city of Lviv. And that was essentially the basis of what was going to be an attempt to push Catholic Rus or Ruthenian civilization eastwards to to conquer it from the Mongols. Alas, that doesn't happen. Instead, that nucleus of a Ruthenian Rus civilization, which is Catholicized, is instead assimilated into Poland and Lithuania, which then becomes the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. And that, I believe, is the great civilizational split between what can be considered a Muscovite Russian civilization and what could be considered a precursor of a Ukrainian Russian civilization. The emphasis on the word I use, Ruthenian, as opposed to Russian. Where does Ruthenian come from? Well, Ruthenian is basically a Latinized version of Russian. So if we're looking at this in terms of Catholicism vis-a-vis Eastern Orthodoxy, it's only appropriate that the version of Russia that we have in the West is a Latinized version of Russia, which then becomes Ruthenian. So Ruthenian is basically there in association with the West. First of all, is this Principality of Haliach, the King of Russia, and then, if I remember correctly, the Kingdom of Galicia. But then it becomes associated with the Ruthenians living under the control of the King of Poland and the Grand Duke of Lithuania. And in opposition to that, we have the Orthodox Tsar in Moscow. And essentially, the Muscovite princes accumulate various honors and prestigious titles unto themselves in order to differentiate themselves. So one of their legitimating factors is that when Constantinople, just before it was taken by the Turks, the ecumenical patriarch and the emperor of Constantinople had tried to unify the Roman and the Eastern churches. The Russians basically said, we have never become associated with the Catholic Church. We have never come to a union between Rome and the East. And that was essentially, they believed that was a cause for them being taken over by the Turks in terms of some sort of a great religious retribution for that act. Of course, right. I don't believe it, but that's a legitimating argument in terms of Russian exceptionalism and the Russian claim to be the emperors. Likewise, the Russians created for themselves their own patriarch. And how does Russia, you can say, establish itself again under the Romanovs in the 17th century? It's by fighting off the Catholic Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, who attempted to put a Catholic as Tsar of the Russias. I believe he was a member of the Swedish royal house at that time. So you can say in terms of Putin's own conception of Rus versus Ukrainian civilization, it could be seen in terms of this great schism, a schism behind the westernizing effects or the Catholicization of the Western Rus versus the stalwart Eastern Orthodoxy of Muscovy, which he links back to you can say, the original inception of Russian civilization as a Catholic, not Catholic, as a Christian entity with the baptism of Vladimir the Great.
Right, it's very interesting. There's many layers to this thing, aren't there? I don't know if you ever played the game Crusader Kings. I've only played a small amount of it, but on that, it's sort of interesting. It helps, perhaps, it could actually help with people's understanding of history that you've got sort of one layer which is sort of hard borders between powers. And then there's just a whole other layer that's cultural, another one that's religious. And they don't all marry up perfectly or hardly ever. They overlap and of course change over time and all that sort of thing. But it's fascinating. I guess to sort of move away a little bit from sort of the spiritual side of things, I wanted to ask you about whether I've got this idea in my mind, and I want you to tell me how terribly wrong it is or low resolution it is. But you've got this idea, if we're talking sort of post 12th century, let's say, something like that, that you've got these big cities, like you mentioned Novgorod. There's like the princes of Novgorod, and there's sort of the grand dukes of Muscovy, of Moscow, and Kiev is a power in its own right in all sorts of ways at different points. This is what I'm asking. In Western Europe, I think you can think of, at least in some way, that you've got like a big city, like big ancient cities like London and Paris. I know this comparison isn't going to be perfect, but nonetheless, you've got two fairly ancient cities like London and Paris, and they're sort of cultural and military powerhouses in their own right, and they're obviously at odds with each other, enemies, rivals. And I mean, how well does that sort of map on to sort of Novgorod and Moscow and Kiev? And at different points, they might sort of conquer each other or be in alliance with each other in some way. Do you see, in your view, in sort of the early or high Middle Ages, that Moscow and Kiev are rivals, enemies, or part of the same entity? Certainly not a centralised state in the modern sense. Could you talk to me a little bit about that? How, in your mind, in your understanding, how closely related do Kiev and Moscow, and I suppose to a lesser extent, but still massively important, Novgorod, how much do they marry up? Because, of course, one last thing before I sort of let you speak is, the Scandinavian, almost Arctic region is very, very different to sort of the Black Sea, Pontic steppe region. They're not very close to each other, really. We're talking about vast distances here. And Moscow's really quite far a long way east, isn't it, compared to Kiev, really, when you look at a map. Talk to me about the relationship between Moscow and Kiev back to the early and higher Middle Ages.
So in terms of trying to sum up, I think the question, so are we talking essentially about a nation vis-a-vis a collection of city-states?
Yes. Did that ever really exist?
So did Russia look more like medieval England or medieval Italy?
Yes, yeah.
Well, like I said with Vladimir the Great, and again, in terms of the impossibilities of managing such a vast empire, apart from navigating the rivers, Russia during the medieval period was never simply one city controlling all the others. It was a system of marriages, a system of sort of dynastic connections, and a understanding that one of these princes was superior to all the others. And of course, the underling princes weren't very happy with that arrangement most of the time. And Yaroslav the Wise tried to sort the situation out between the fundamentally divided state of the Rus cities by trying to set it up essentially that when a Rus prince died, he would move on to a more prestigious city and then go round and go round. And this was called the rota system. And of course, you can probably already suspect the difficulties in maintaining that system because that was simply an invitation to fratricide and regicide.
Right, yeah.
So there was an incentive to civil war, which was actually baked into the legal system of Russia at that time, which was something that, or the Rus at that time, in case anyone sort of attacks me for using these words, and that's something that Putin glossed over quite a lot in terms of the bizarre nature of the medieval system of inheritance. But essentially, you're right, and that sets up the whole idea that Russia, throughout the first sort of 2 centuries of its existence, is essentially a series of competing city-states. And as a result of that, Kiev loses its primacy rather early on. I mean, again, and just in terms of memory serves, coming up with the other cities. So we have a large number of cities collected around the city of Kiev, such as Chernigov, such as Pereyaslav. Then we have cities such as Smolensk, Vladimir, Novgorod, all of these sort of competing interests and principalities, which of course are essentially authorities unto themselves. You can say that had the Mongols not come around, there may have been a process where it wouldn't have been the Prince of Kiev at this point, it would have been the Prince of Vladimir, may have begun, like we see in France, a attempt to collect, or the Russian historiographical term is gather, the Rus lands altogether. There may have been an attempt as early as the 13th century to gather all the lands under Vladimir, but this didn't happen because the Mongols came, and that created the great breach in Russian civilization that I've been talking about. But in terms of your specific question versus Moscow v. Kiev, that really isn't even a question that we can entertain, because when Moscow enters its early sort of history in the 14th century, Kiev is basically ransacked, and then Kiev will be occupied by the Lithuanians. So its sovereignty as a power is already negated at that point. And when talking about the great contest between city-states, which you've alluded to, it was actually the Muscovites against the city of Ryazan or the city of Tver. their immediate neighbors clustered around the region, which is essentially Muscovy, also the great metropole of modern Moscow. And they would compete between themselves, but they would also compete for the favor, interestingly enough, of the Golden Horde. They would basically say, I am a more efficient or effective collector of taxes for you. I can gather more tribute than this city-state. So you can say that in addition to having this city conflict that you're talking about, this decentralized city conflict that would make it more reminiscent of the Italian cities up until, I don't know, the 16th century. When you look at Moscow, you have that, but you also have this attempt for these various rulers to become tax farmers for the Great Horde. And it's only by one of these tax farmers, I believe he was Prince Ivan, who then became Ivan Kalinka, or Moneybags, which again indicate his use for the Golden Horde, who became more useful than all of the other princes, Ryazan and Tver, to the point that he was able to monopolize a position of primacy, which was conferred by the Mongols, this title of the Grand Prince of Vladimir, to the point that by the early 15th century, Moscow has become a very large state vis-a-vis other European powers. It has also gotten rid of this idea of the rota succession that I brought in earlier, the idea that all the princes would be incentivized to go around and fratricide each other in order to gain power.
To watch the full video, please become a premium member at lotuseaters.com.